In Millbrook, everyone knew the rules. Keep your head down, don't ask questions, and never, ever challenge a police officer's authority. For generations, the badge had been both shield and weapon, protecting those who abused power while crushing those who dared resist. Then Ethan Carter made one fatal mistake. He stood his ground. Now a decorated special ops veteran lies beaten in a cell, his dog tags broken on the pavement outside, while a corrupt sergeant works to bury the truth. But what they see as just another victim to silence is about to become their worst nightmare, because they forgot the first rule of combat. Never corner a soldier who's got nothing left to lose. The Pentagon's calling. The FBI's watching. And one man's wrongful arrest is about to expose a system so corrupt it will take the entire precinct down with it. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The setting sun cast long shadows across Veterans Memorial Park as Ethan Carter finished his evening run. His German Shepherd Shadow trotted faithfully beside him, both of them maintaining the disciplined pace ingrained by years of military training. Ethan's dog tags clinked softly against his chest with each step, a familiar rhythm that somehow kept the memories at bay. These evening runs had become his sanctuary since returning home, a way to quiet the echoes of war that still haunted his dreams. Running helped. It always had. The steady impact of feet on pavement, the controlled breathing. It all brought him back to the present when his mind threatened to drag him into the past. Tonight, though, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the police cruiser had circled the block 3 times, or how the officer's eyes had lingered a bit too long on him in shadow. Or perhaps it was the whispered conversations he'd overheard at the Veterans Center about increased police harassment in their neighborhood. Ethan had seen that look before, here in Millbrook. It was the same look he'd gotten when he first moved back, despite his press suits and security consultant credentials. To some, he would always be just another tall black man in a town where that alone made you suspicious. The thought made his jaw clench, but he kept running, one foot in front of the other, Shadow's steady presence beside him a constant reminder to stay focused, stay calm. "Good run today, boy," Ethan praised, reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears as they finished their cool-down walk. The dog leaned into his touch, tail wagging contentedly. These moments of peace were precious, a reminder that civilian life could be good, could be normal, even with everything he'd seen and done overseas. Late October air had a bite to it as Ethan drove home after his run. Shadow sat in the back seat, head tilted toward the open window, ears perking at every passing sound. They were almost home when the red and blue lights of a gas station caught his attention. The tank was nearly empty, and tomorrow would be busy with client meetings for his security consulting business. "Might as well fill up now, boy," Ethan murmured to Shadow, pulling into the station. The forecourt was mostly empty, just a couple of cars at the far pumps and a police cruiser parked near the convenience store entrance. Ethan noticed how the officers inside watched him through the store windows as he swiped his card at the pump. Their scrutiny was nothing new, but it still made his combat-trained senses tingle with awareness. He had just finished paying when he noticed a commotion near the convenience store entrance. 2 officers had cornered a black teenager against the wall, their stance aggressive despite the boy's obvious fear. The scene made Ethan's stomach tighten with a familiar mix of anger and resignation. The kid couldn't have been more than 15, wearing a Letterman jacket from Millbrook High. His hands were raised, trembling slightly as one officer leaned in close, almost nose to nose. Derek's jaw tightened. Every instinct from his special ops days screamed at him to intervene. But experience had taught him that sometimes watching and waiting was the smarter play. He'd learned the hard way that in Millbrook, even a decorated veteran couldn't always protect others without making things worse. He took his time replacing the gas cap, keeping the scene in his peripheral vision while pretending to check his phone. The officer's voice carried across the nearly empty lot. "Where'd you get money for that jacket, boy? Looks too nice for someone like you." The teenager's voice shook as he responded, "Sir, I'm on the football team. It's my school jacket." I can show you my ID. Keep your hands where they are, the second officer barked as the boy started to reach for his pocket. The kid inched, his back pressing harder against the wall as if he could somehow sink into it. Ethan memorized their badge numbers, noting how neither officer had activated their body cameras. He'd seen this pattern before. The intimidation, the implied threats, the careful dance of power meant to provoke a reaction that would justify escalation. It was the same story playing out across America, but here in Millbrook, it seemed especially brazen. Back in his car, Ethan took the long way home, his mind replaying the scene. Shadow whined softly from the back seat, picking up on his tension. I know. Boy, he sighed. Some things never change. He thought about the kid in the Letterman jacket, wondered if he should have done something. But what? In a town where the police department had a reputation for making problems disappear, speaking up often meant painting a target on your own back. The first police cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror 3 blocks from home. Ethan checked his speed exactly at the limit. His registration was current, lights all working. Still, he knew what was coming before the lights flashed. It was almost predictable, like a script he'd read too many times before. Ethan pulled over smoothly, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. Shadow stirred in the back seat but stayed quiet, trained to remain calm in tense situations. The cruiser door opened, and in his side mirror, Ethan watched Captain Roy Mercer approach, hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. Even in the growing darkness, Ethan could see the swagger in his walk, the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. License and registration, Mercer demanded without preamble, his flashlight beam unnecessarily bright in Ethan's face. The light moved deliberately across the interior of the car, lingering on Shadow before returning to Ethan's eyes. May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer? Ethan kept his voice steady, professional. He'd learned long ago that tone could mean the difference between a warning and a night in jail, especially in towns like Millbrook. Suspicious vehicle in a high-crime area, Mercer replied, his tone making it clear the only suspicious thing was Ethan himself. License. Now, Ethan reached slowly for his wallet. I'm going to get my ID from my back pocket, sir. Each movement was deliberate, choreographed to avoid any misinterpretation. He'd practiced this dance too many times, both before and after his military service. He handed over his license, registration, and military ID, a habit from years of similar stops. Mercer studied the IDs with exaggerated scrutiny, turning them over in his hands as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. Military, huh? Special ops? His tone dripped with skepticism. These look suspicious to me. Where'd you get these made? Those are legitimate federal IDs, Sergeant. I served 12 years, discharged honorably last year. Derek felt his pulse, quickened but kept his voice level. You can verify that with step out of the vehicle. Mercer cut him off, already reaching for the door handle. A second cruiser pulled up, its lights painting the street in rhythmic red and blue. The situation was escalating faster than Ethan had anticipated, and he could feel control slipping away. Sir, I haven't committed any offense. I'd like to know. Out now. Mercer yanked the door open. And keep your hands where I can see them. Ethan complied, moving with careful precision. Shadow growled low in his throat, but stayed put, his training holding despite the tension crackling in the air. The second officer approached from behind, while Mercer continued his hostile interrogation. Through the flashing lights, Ethan noticed a young female officer standing by the second cruiser, watching the scene with what looked like uncertainty. We had a robbery reported. Suspect matches your description. Mercer's hand hadn't left his weapon. Tall black male, dark jacket. That description could match thousands of people. Ethan stated calmly, I've been at the park running, then stopped for gas. You can check the camera footage. You refusing to cooperate? Mercer stepped closer, invading Ethan's space. Getting argumentative now. No, sir. I'm simply stating facts and asserting my rights as a citizen and a veteran. The mention of rights was all the excuse Mercer needed. He grabbed Ethan's arm roughly, trying to spin him around. Ethan's combat-trained reflexes instinctively pulled away from the aggressive move, a natural response that Mercer had likely been counting on. "He's resisting," Mercer shouted. Though Ethan had already frozen in place, hands raised, the second officer rushed in, and suddenly Ethan was slammed face first onto the pavement. His dog tag snapped free as Mercer drove a knee into his back, the metal links scattering across the asphalt like broken promises. "Stop resisting," Mercer yelled, though Ethan wasn't moving. A fist crashed into his ribs, then another. Shadow was barking now, but thankfully stayed in the car as trained. Through the ringing in his ears, Ethan heard the click of cell phone cameras and voices raised in protest. "Everyone back up!" The second officer shouted at the small crowd gathering on the sidewalk. "Turn those phones off now." Ethan tasted blood as his face was ground into the asphalt. He could hear Mercer reading him his rights between threats, and accusations could feel the cold bite of handcuffs cutting into his wrists. But his mind was elsewhere, back in the desert, in another time when he'd been pinned down, fighting to breathe through the pain and the panic. The flashback threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to stay present to remember his training. "Got ourselves a real tough guy here," Mercer laughed, hauling Ethan roughly to his feet. "Let's see how tough you are down at the station." His voice carried a promise of worse to come, a threat that made the young female officer shift uncomfortably. Through swollen eyes, Ethan saw his broken dog tags glinting on the pavement as he was shoved into the back of the police car. Shadow's desperate howls faded as they drove away, leaving behind a scene that would soon spark an inferno of consequences no one could have predicted. The drive to the precinct was a blur of pain and mounting dread. Ethan had seen enough during his time overseas to recognize the signs of systemic corruption, and everything about this arrest reeked of it. Mercer hadn't even bothered to recover the dog tags, a small but telling detail that spoke volumes about his respect for military service. The precinct they pulled into was notorious in Millbrook's black community. Stories circulated about evidence that disappeared, about confessions extracted through force, about people who went in for questioning and came out changed, but Ethan had never expected to experience it firsthand, had somehow thought his service record might shield him from the worst of it. As they roughly removed him from the car, Ethan caught sight of the young female officer, Officer Hart, according to her nameplate, watching from the doorway. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment he saw something like doubt cross her face. Then Mercer shoved him forward, and the moment was gone. "Welcome to my house." "Tough guy," Mercer sneered, pushing Ethan through the precinct doors. "Let's see what other charges we can add to that resistance." His voice carried the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to wielding power without consequences. Ethan said nothing, his military training kicking in. Name, rank, and serial number. The basics of surviving captivity. Only this time, he was on American soil, being held by those sworn to protect and serve. The irony wasn't lost on him as the doors closed behind them, sealing him into what would become the longest night of his life since returning home. The precinct buzzed with late-night activity, but Derek noticed how some officers pointedly looked away as Mercer paraded him through the building. Others watched with a mix of indifference and subtle approval, telling him everything he needed to know about how deep the corruption ran. The last thing he saw before they pushed him toward booking was his own blood, leaving a trail on the pristine floor, and the way Officer Hart turned away, unable to watch. In that moment, Derek understood with perfect clarity that his real battle wasn't overseas anymore. It was right here at home, and it was just beginning. As they led him deeper into the precinct, Derek's military training kicked in, cataloging exits, cameras, and potential allies. He might be in enemy territory, but he'd been behind enemy lines before. The difference was, this time the enemy wore badges instead of combat fatigues, and the war zone was the very streets he'd sworn to protect. The booking room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. Blood from Ethan's split lip dripped onto the fingerprint card as Officer Daniel Pierce roughly pressed each of his fingers against the ink pad. The process was deliberately slow, each movement designed to remind Ethan that he was no longer in control. Smearing the prints, Daniel Pierce muttered, wiping away the blood with unnecessary force. Gonna have to do it again. He grabbed Ethan's hand harder this time, bending his fingers back just enough to cause pain without leaving marks. The message was clear. This was just a beginning. Through the glass partition, Ethan could see Sergeant Mercer talking to another officer, gesturing animatedly with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Their laughter carried through the thin walls, punctuated by phrases like playing soldier and taught him his place. Stand still, Daniel Pierce barked, yanking Ethan's attention back to the booking process. The camera flash left spots in his vision as they took his mugshot. No one had read him his rights. No one had allowed him his phone call. Standard procedure was already out the window. Well, if it isn't the great American hero. Mercer's voice dripped with sarcasm as he entered the booking room. He held Ethan's military ID between two fingers like it was contaminated. Quite the story you've made up here. Special ops? Blackhawks? Must think you're some kind of movie star. Ethan kept his face neutral, though his pulse quickened. Years of training had taught him to read rooms, to sense when situations were about to escalate. Everything about Mercer's body language screamed danger. My service record is easily verifiable, Sergeant. One phone call to the Pentagon. The Pentagon. Mercer's laugh was sharp and cold. You really committed to this story, didn't you? He turned to the other officers. Betty bought this fancy ID off some website. Probably uses it to scam free drinks at bars. The holding cell they pushed him into was already occupied. 3 men sat on the metal bench, while 2 more huddled in the corners. The smell of sweat and despair hung heavy in the air. Ethan recognized one of the men immediately. Robert Hayes, a homeless veteran he'd helped at the shelter last month. Ethan, Robert's voice was barely a whisper. Man, what are they doing to you? Before Ethan could respond, Mercer's voice cut through the air. Making friends already? Perfect. Hey, Hayes. Your buddy here claims he's military too. Maybe you can swap war stories. His laugh echoed down the corridor as he walked away. Robert shifted over, making space on the bench. They've gone too far this time, he muttered. Picking up a decorated vet like you? That's gonna bring heat. The other men in the cell were watching now, their expressions a mix of recognition and concern. One of them, an older man with haunted eyes, nodded slowly. I've seen you at the VA center. You're the one who's been helping guys get their benefits sorted. The conversation died as footsteps approached. Officer Emily Hart appeared, clipboard in hand. Her eyes met Ethan's briefly before darting away. Carter, she called out, her voice professional but lacking Mercer's malice. Your public defender is here. The interview room was barely bigger than a closet. Andrew Parker, the public defender, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His tie was crooked and coffee stains dotted his wrinkled shirt. He barely glanced at the file in front of him before speaking. They're charging you with resisting arrest, aggravated assault on a police officer, and possession of stolen property. Parker rattled off, stifling a yawn. My recommendation is to plead guilty to the lesser charges. They might drop the aggravated. Assault. I haven't done anything wrong, Ethan stated firmly. I want to make a formal complaint about excessive force and racial profiling. Parker's laugh was tired and bitter. Against Sergeant Mercer in this precinct? Look, I get it. You're angry, but trust me, fighting this will only make things worse. These charges could put you away for years. Take the deal. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across Parker's face. Through the thin walls, Ethan could hear Mercer's voice again, louder now, probably purposely so. Got another one playing the race card. Mercer was saying, they never learn. Always want to make it about that, instead of their own choices. Parker shuffled his papers, clearly uncomfortable. Think about the offer. It's the best you're going to get. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Through the interview room's small window, Derek saw officers escorting a young man with a bloodied face past the door. Officer Hart trailed behind them, her expression troubled. Got what he deserved, one officer was saying. Tried to get smart about his rights. The wall seemed to close in as memories of similar rooms in foreign countries flooded Ethan's mind. The bright lights, the disorientation, the casual cruelty. It was all too familiar. His breathing quickened, and he forced himself to focus on his training. Assess the situation. Identify potential allies. Stay alert. I need to make my phone call, Ethan insisted, his voice steady despite the growing pressure in his chest. Maybe later, Parker replied, already standing. Think about what I said. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He was gone before. Ethan could protest further. Back in the holding cell, the atmosphere had changed. More detainees had been brought in, including the young man with the bloodied face. He sat in the corner, quiet sobs shaking his shoulders. Robert had moved closer to Ethan, his presence a silent show of support. They've been doing this for years, Robert whispered. But taking down someone like you? That's different. People will notice. The hours crawled by. Officers walked past regularly, some ignoring the detainees completely, others making subtle threats or mocking comments. Through it all, Ethan observed, memorized, planned. His military training had taught him that information was power, and every passing moment revealed more about the precinct's corrupt operation. Near midnight, the relative quiet was broken by raised voices from the booking area. A woman's voice, fierce and determined, cut through the normal station noise. I don't care about your procedures. My brother is a decorated veteran, and you have no right to hold him without charges. Ethan's heart leaped. Madeline, his sister, must have gotten word about his arrest. Her voice carried down the corridor, each word clear and precise. Her voice carried down the corridor, each word clear and precise. I'm a journalist, and I promise you this story will not stay buried. Now either let me see my brother, or I start making calls to every news outlet in the state. Mercer's response was too quiet to hear, but his tone was unmistakable. Moments later, Madeline's voice rose again. Is that a threat, Sergeant Mercer? Please say that again. I'd love to quote you directly in my article. The confrontation continued, but the voices moved away from the holding area. Robert nudged Ethan gently. Your sister sounds like a fighter. She is, Ethan replied, a small smile touching his lips despite the pain. And she's exactly what they're afraid of, someone who knows how to make noise. Officer Hart appeared, again this time with a first aid kit. She glanced up and down the corridor before approaching the cell. I'm supposed to document your injuries, she said, her voice professional, but her eyes conveying something else, uncertainty, perhaps even guilt. As she cleaned the cut on his face, her hands were gentle, different from the rough treatment he'd received so far. This isn't right, she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. Then do something about it. He responded just as quietly. She drew back, conflict clear on her face. Before she could respond, another officer appeared at the end of the corridor. Hart quickly packed up the first aid kit, her professional, mask slipping back into place. The night wore on. More detainees were brought in, most of them black or Hispanic. Each told a similar story. Minor traffic violations, vague descriptions matching reported crimes, resisting arrest charges that appeared out of nowhere. The pattern was clear, but what disturbed Ethan most was how routine it all seemed. Around 2 a.m, Mercer returned. He stood outside the cell, twirling Ethan's military ID in his hands. Had an interesting conversation with your sister, he said, his tone conversational but his eyes hard. Quite the family you've got. A wannabe soldier and a muckraking journalist. Derek remained silent, which seemed to irritate Mercer more than any response would have. You know it's funny, Mercer continued. We've got this robbery case that's been giving us trouble. Suspect matches your description perfectly, and wouldn't you know it, we found some interesting items in your car. The threat was clear. They were planning to plant evidence, to turn a false arrest into something much worse. Ethan's mind raced, calculating options, evaluating risks. He'd faced interrogations before, but this was different. This was happening on American soil, in a place meant to represent law and order. You've got a choice to make, Mercer said, leaning closer to the bars. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Confess to the robbery, take a plea deal, and all this goes away. Keep playing tough guy." He let the threat hang in the air. From his position on the bench, Derek could see Officer Hart down the corridor, pretending to file paperwork, but clearly listening. She wasn't the only one. Other officers lingered nearby, some looking uncomfortable, others seemingly entertained by the show. "I know my rights," Derek stated calmly, "and I know what you're doing is illegal." Mercer's smile widened, writes, "In my precinct, you've got exactly the rights I say you've got. Remember that." As Mercer walked away, Ethan noticed Brooke slip into a side room, her phone in her hand. Something about her posture, the furtive way she looked around first, suggested she wasn't making a routine call. The night stretched endlessly. Every hour brought new examples of the precinct's corruption. Officers joked openly about planting evidence, about meeting arrest quotas, about which neighborhoods to target. They seemed unconcerned about being overheard, confident in their impunity. Dawn was approaching when they came for Ethan again. This time it was Daniel Pierce and another officer he didn't recognize. They didn't speak as they led him to an interrogation room, but their grips on his arms were unnecessarily tight. The interrogation room was colder than the cell, the single light harsh and directed at the chair they pushed him into. Mercer entered a few minutes later, carrying a thick file. "Let's talk about that robbery," he said, dropping the file on the table. "We've got witnesses placing you at the scene. We've got evidence in your car. The only question is whether you want to make this easier on yourself." Ethan's training kicked in again. He'd been taught how to handle interrogations, how to resist psychological pressure. But there was something surreal about using those skills here, against the very people meant to protect and serve. "I want to speak to a lawyer," he stated firmly. "A real one, not the public defender who spent 5 minutes with me." Mercer's face hardened. "You're really going to play it this way? After everything we found in your car? You mean everything you planted in my car?" The punch came without warning, catching Ethan in the ribs where he was already bruised from the arrest. He managed not to make a sound, which seemed to infuriate Marshall further. "You think you're tough because you played soldier? Let me tell you something. In here your service means nothing. You're just another perp trying to work the system." Through the pain, Ethan noticed something. The interrogation room's camera, normally blinking red when active, was dark. They'd turned it off, confident that no one would question what happened in this room. The door opened and Officer Hart stepped in. "Sergeant, there's a situation at the front desk. Some reporters are asking questions about last night's arrests." Mercer's expression flickered with annoyance. "Handle it. They're specifically asking about Mr. Carter, sir. Something about his military record being verified by—" "I said handle it," Mercer snapped, but Ethan caught the flash of uncertainty in his eyes. The mention of verification had rattled him, if only slightly. As Mercer stormed out, Hart lingered for a moment. Her eyes met Ethan's, and this time there was something more than uncertainty there. She glanced meaningfully at the camera, then back at him, before following Mercer out. Left alone in the interrogation room, Ethan allowed himself a small smile despite his injuries. The camera being off meant no official record, but it also meant Mercer's precinct wasn't as airtight as he thought. There were cracks in the system, and where there were cracks, there was hope. Through the walls, he could hear Ray's voices from the front desk. His sister's voice was among them, still fighting, still refusing to back down. Somewhere out there, Shadow was waiting, probably being cared for by neighbors. And in this very building, at least one officer was beginning to question the corrupt system she was part of. The sun was rising over Millbrook, its light barely visible through the interrogation room's small window. Ethan sat straight in his chair, ignoring the pain, his military bearing intact. They could take his F. Samuel Knoxham temporarily, but they couldn't take his dignity or his truth. The real battle was just beginning, and this time he wasn't fighting alone. Morning light filtered through the precinct's grimy windows as Sergeant Mercer stormed through the bullpen, his face flushed with anger. The reporters had finally left, but their questions lingered in the air like smoke. Behind him, Officer Daniel Pierce carried a brown evidence bag, his expression carefully neutral. "Planted deep," Mercer instructed, keeping his voice low. "Under The spare tire. Make it look like he tried to hide it. He glanced toward the holding cells where Ethan sat, his military posture unchanged despite the night's abuse. Our hero's about to become a common thief. Daniel Pierce nodded and slipped out the back door, heading for the impound lot where Ethan's car waited. The German Shepherd had been removed hours ago, taken to animal control despite protests from Ethan's sister. Now the vehicle sat alone, a perfect canvas for their fabricated evidence. At her desk, Officer Emily Hart pretended to focus on paperwork while her phone silently recorded Mercer's instructions. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the device deeper into her pocket, knowing that one wrong move could destroy everything, including her career or worse. Officer Hart, Mercer's voice made her jump, need you to process some evidence. A stolen wallet and a knife found in our suspect's vehicle. He dropped a property receipt on her desk. Make sure the paperwork's clean. Yes, sir, Hart responded, noting how the receipt was already filled out, time-stamped from the previous night. She'd seen enough falsified documents to recognize the pattern, but this time felt different. This time, she had proof. In the holding cell, Ethan watched the morning shift change bring fresh officers into the precinct. Most avoided looking at him, but a few stared openly, clearly having heard about the fake veteran who dared to resist arrest. His ribs ached from Mercer's interrogation room visit, but he kept his spine straight, his face composed. Robert Hayes, the homeless veteran who'd recognized him, had been released an hour ago. Before leaving, he'd whispered, "Words getting out, brother. The streets are talking." Ethan had nodded almost imperceptibly, knowing that in Millbrook, street gossip traveled faster than official news. The precinct doors burst open as Billy Hayes, a young gas station worker, was escorted in by two officers. Ethan recognized him from the previous night. He'd been working when Ethan stopped for gas just before the arrest. The officers led Hayes toward an interview room, but not before Ethan caught the fear in the young man's eyes. "Just tell them what you saw," one officer was saying, his tone carrying a clear threat. "How you witnessed Carter acting suspicious. Maybe saw him near where the robbery went down. But I didn't." Hayes' protest was cut off as the interview. Room door closed behind them. Mercer emerged from his office, a satisfied smirk playing at his lips as he approached Ethan's cell. "Looks like your luck's running out, hero. Got a witness placing you near Daniel Pierce's jewelry last night, right around the time it was robbed." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "The gas station security cameras will show exactly where I was and when." "Funny thing about those cameras," Mercer replied. "System had a glitch last night, no footage." He leaned closer to the bars. "But don't worry. Plenty of reliable witnesses saw you acting suspicious in the area." Down the corridor, Hart's hand tightened around her phone. The footage wasn't gone. She'd already secured a copy along with the body cam videos that supposedly didn't exist. Each new piece of evidence felt like a live wire in her pocket. Dangerous, but vital. The morning crawled forward. Ethan observed as more witnesses were brought in, each emerging from their interviews looking shaken. The pattern was clear. Mercer was building a false narrative piece by piece, using intimidation to create a chorus of lies. Around noon, Ray's voices echoed from the front desk. "I have a right to see my client." The voice was female, authoritative. "I'm his attorney and I demand—" "Olivia Bennett?" Ethan straightened at the familiar name. Olivia had been his friend since high school, and now she was one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys. "Ma'am, Mr. Carter already has representation," came the desk sergeant's response. "You mean that public defender who spent 5 minutes with him? I'm filing as his counsel of record right now. Either let me see him or I start filing civil rights violations." Mercer appeared, his face darkening as he recognized Olivia. They had history. She'd exposed police misconduct, before though never anything this big. "Ms. Bennett, come to defend another criminal?" "Sergeant Mercer." Olivia's voice was ice cold, still fabricating evidence to meet arrest quotas. Their standoff was interrupted by commotion from the interview room. Billy Hayes burst out, his face pale. "I won't do it. I won't lie about what I saw. Get him back in there Mercer snapped. But Hayes was already running toward the exit. I saw everything. Hayes shouted as officers grabbed him. Carter was at my gas station. He didn't do anything wrong. They're trying to make me. A hand clamped over his mouth as they dragged him away. Olivia's phone appeared, recording the scene. Anyone else want to explain what's happening here? Put that away, Mercer growled. No recordings in the precinct. Public buildings, Sergeant. I have every right to document police misconduct. She turned toward where Brooks sat. Officer, you're witnessing this. I hope you're prepared to testify about what's happening in this precinct. Hart looked away, but her hand pressed against her phone, remembering all the evidence already gathered there. One witness willing to speak truth had already been silenced. She couldn't risk the same happening to her, not when she might be Ethan's best chance at justice. In his cell, Ethan felt the atmosphere shift. Olivia's presence had introduced a new dynamic, one that clearly rattled Mercer, but that made him more dangerous, not less. Men like Mercer were most lethal when cornered. The afternoon brought new developments. Daniel Pierce returned from the impound lot, exchanging quiet words with Mercer. Hart, pretending to file reports nearby, caught fragments, wallets in place, knife under the spare. Looks convincing. Olivia positioned herself where she could see into Ethan's cell, her laptop open as she worked. Every few minutes, she made a show of documenting something, letting Mercer know that every moment was being recorded, every action noted. Your sister's article is gaining traction, she told Ethan during a brief consultation. The Pentagon's been contacted. This is bigger than Mercer realizes. Ethan nodded, processing the information. Be careful, he warned. They're desperate enough to plant evidence. No telling what else they might do. As if to prove his point, the precinct's energy shifted again as Mercer gathered his trusted officers. Through the holding cell's bars, Ethan watched their huddle, noting how Hart lingered at the edges, pretending to sort papers while her phone continued its silent recording. Listen up, Mercer was saying, his voice pitched low but carrying, just far enough. This needs to be handled tonight. We've got the evidence in place. Bennett is going to be a problem, but Carter confesses her hands are tied. One officer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, with the Pentagon involved. The Pentagon? Mercer laughed. By the time they mobilize any real investigation, this will be a closed case. Carter will be just another criminal claiming police misconduct. Happens every day. The group dispersed, but not before Ethan caught Mercer's next words. If he won't confess willingly, we have other methods tonight after Bennett leaves. The threat hung in the air as afternoon shadows lengthened into evening. Olivia worked steadily, her presence a shield that wouldn't last through the night. Hart made several trips to the evidence room, each time returning more tense than before. Around 6, Madeline Carter returned to the precinct, this time with a senior reporter from the city paper. Mercer intercepted them before they reached the front desk, but not before Madeline called out to her brother. The story's going live tonight, Ethan. People are going to know the truth. Mercer's response was immediate. Get them out of here and check the holding cell. Our suspect seems to be inciting disruption. 2 officers approached Ethan's cell. He recognized their type, the kind who enjoyed the darker aspects of their power. Behind them, Brooke stood, frozen, her face pale, as she realized what was coming. Time for a cell check, one officer announced, unlocking the door. Up against the wall, hands behind your back. Ethan complied, his military training warring with his instinct for self-preservation. The first punch took him in the kidney, driving him to his knees. The second caught him in the ribs, aggravating his existing injuries. Stop resisting, the officer said loudly. Though Ethan hadn't moved, it was part of their script, creating a false narrative to justify the violence. Through the pain, Ethan heard Olivia's voice from the front desk. I need to see my client now. He's being disciplined for disrupting the facility. Came the response. No visitors. The beating continued, methodical and precise. These officers knew how to cause pain while minimizing visible damage. Through swollen eyes, Derek saw Hart step forward, then stop as Mercer appeared behind her. "Problem, Officer Hart." She shook her head, but her hand wrapped around her phone like a lifeline. Another piece of evidence added to her growing collection, another witness to the precinct's corruption. When the officers finally stepped back, Ethan remained on his knees, breathing carefully through broken ribs. They'd been thorough, but he'd endured worse during his training. What troubled him more was the look in Mercer's eyes. This was just a beginning. As night fell over Millbrook, the precinct settled into its evening routine. Olivia had been forced to leave, promising to return first thing in the morning. Madeline's story would break overnight, throwing a spotlight on the precinct's practices. But now in the gathering darkness, Ethan faced his most dangerous hours. Hart worked late, her movements becoming more urgent as she sensed the growing tension. Mercer was gathering his most trusted officers, preparing for whatever they had planned for the night shift. "Our heroes had time to think," Mercer told his team. "Tonight, we get our confession, whatever it takes." In his cell, Ethan closed, his eyes centering himself. He'd been trained to resist interrogation, to withstand torture. But this was different. These were American police officers, men and women sworn to protect and serve, now preparing to break him by any means necessary. The Abbas night shift brought new faces to the precinct, officers who looked at Mercer with something close to worship. These were his true believers, cops who had fully embraced the corruption he represented. "Time for a private conversation," Mercer announced as two officers approached Ethan's cell. Somewhere quieter, as they led him toward the interrogation rooms, Ethan caught a glimpse of Hart at her desk. She was typing rapidly, her face illuminated by her computer screen. Something about her expression, determination mixed with fear, told him she was making her own preparations for whatever came next. The interrogation room was cold, its single light casting harsh shadows. They sat him in a metal chair, but didn't cuff him to it, a detail that spoke volumes about their intentions. No restraints meant no marks, no evidence of what they planned to do. "Last chance," Mercer said as the door closed behind them. "Confess to the robbery, take the plea deal, and this all goes away. Otherwise," he gestured to the officers flanking Ethan, "we do this the hard way." Ethan sat straight, channeling every bit of his military bearing. "Do what you want, Sergeant. But remember, people are watching now. The truth's already getting out." Mercer's smile was cold. The truth is whatever we say it is. By morning, you'll be a disgraced veteran who tried to use his service record to hide his crimes. Just another sad story of a soldier who couldn't readjust to civilian life. The first blow caught Ethan in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. As he fought to breathe, he heard Mercer continue, "No cameras in here. No witnesses. Just us having a quiet talk about your confession." Outside the interrogation room, Hart stood at her desk, her heart pounding. The evidence she'd gathered burned in her pocket. Videos, recordings, documentation of every illegal act she'd witnessed. One phone call would send it all to Olivia Bennett, to the press, to the Pentagon itself. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. From the interrogation room came the muffled sounds of violence, of Mercer's team doing what they'd done so many times before. But this time was different. This time, someone was finally ready to speak truth to power. The night was long, but truth, like sunrise, could not be forever denied. And in that darkened interrogation room, as Mercer's team worked to break him, Derek held on to one certainty. Justice was coming, not just for him, but for every victim of this corrupt precinct. The only question was how many more would suffer before dawn finally broke. Colonel Nathan West stared at his computer screen, his jaw tightening as he read. Madeline Carter's article for the third time. The photos of Derek's injuries, though grainy cell phone shots, told a clear story of police brutality. Behind him, the Pentagon's night shift hummed with activity, but his focus remained on the report of his former soldier's arrest. "Get me everything on the Millbrook Police Department," he ordered his aide, "and contact local FBI. I want eyes on that precinct within the hour." Meanwhile, In the interrogation room, Derek spat blood onto the floor, his military training the only thing keeping him conscious. Mercer's questioning had been going on for hours, but they still didn't have their confession. "You're only making this harder on yourself," Mercer said, wiping his knuckles with a handkerchief. One signature, and all this stops. Ethan looked up through swollen eyes. "You know what we learned in special ops training. Every man breaks eventually, but the real test isn't whether you break. It's what you do after." The response earned him another blow, but he saw the flicker of uncertainty in Mercer's eyes. They were running out of time, and they all knew it. Outside the precinct, the first FBI surveillance vehicles were taking position, their presence masked by civilian plates and darkened windows. Special Agent Vanessa Collins watched the building, through binoculars documenting every entrance and exit. Subject entering through back door, she murmured into her radio. Officer Daniel Pierce, carrying what appears to be evidence bags. Her team had been assembled hastily after Colonel West's call, but they were among the Bureau's best. Inside, Officer Hart sat at her desk, her phone connected to a secure cloud drive as she uploaded the last of her evidence. Her hands trembled as she typed out her statement, documenting weeks of witness misconduct leading up to Derek's arrest. A shadow fell across her desk. "Working late, Hart." Daniel Pierce's voice made her freeze, but her screen was already dark. "Just finishing. Reports, sir," she responded, proud of how steady she kept her voice. "The Carter case has a lot of paperwork." Daniel Pierce lingered, his presence threatening. "Mercer wants everyone's reports to match." "No discrepancies." Of course, Hart nodded. But her finger was already pressing send on her phone, encrypted, files streaming to multiple secure servers. Even if they discovered her now, the evidence was beyond their reach. Across town, Madeline Carter paced in her apartment as more sources came forward. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other victims of the precinct's corruption. Each story reinforced a pattern: false arrests, planted evidence, forced confessions. A knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw two of Mercer's officers. Their expressions suggested this wasn't a friendly visit. "Ms. Carter," one called out, "we need to ask you some questions about your article." Madeline backed away from the door, already dialing Olivia Bennett's number. The attorney answered on the first ring. "They're here," Madeline whispered. "Mercer's men." "Don't open the door," Olivia instructed. "I'm calling the FBI now. Get your evidence somewhere safe." The pounding on the door grew louder. "Ms. Carter, this is your last warning. Open up or we'll have to force entry." Madeline grabbed her laptop and external drives, slipping out the fire escape just as she heard the door splinter. From the alley below, she watched the officers ransack her apartment, their frustration evident when they realized she'd escaped with her evidence intact. Back at the precinct, Mercer was growing increasingly agitated. Reports were coming in about FBI presence in town, and Colonel West's name had surfaced in several calls. "Get rid of everything," he ordered Daniel Pierce. "Clean the evidence room. Wipe the computers. I want this place spotless by morning." But it was already too late. Hart had captured it all. The falsified reports, the planted evidence, the coordinated cover-up. Each piece was now safely stored on secure servers, waiting to expose the precinct's corruption. In the interrogation room, Derek heard the rising panic in the officers' voices. Years of combat had taught him to read a situation's momentum. And right now, everything was shifting. "Sir," an officer burst in, face pale. "The feds are here, actually here in town, and the Pentagon's involved." Mercer's facade cracked slightly. "The Pentagon can't interfere with local police business. They have no jurisdiction. Tell that to Colonel West," the officer replied. "He's on his way." Something about a special ops veteran under his command. The name hit Mercer like a physical blow. Everyone in law enforcement knew Nathan West, the decorated colonel who'd become a fierce advocate for veteran rights. His involvement changed everything. "Get him back to his cell," Mercer snapped, indicating Ethan. "And find Hart. I want every report checked and double-checked before morning." But Hart was already gone, having slipped out during the chaos. In her car, parked 2 blocks away, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Her phone showed the evidence transfers were complete. Everything was now in the hands of those who could use it. Olivia Bennett stood in the federal building downtown, surrounded by FBI agents as they reviewed Hart's evidence. Each video, each recording, built an ironclad case against Mercer and his corrupt precinct. This is systematic, Agent Collins noted, scanning through the files. Years of misconduct, all documented. Officer Hart has given us everything we need, Olivia nodded, already drafting emergency motions. I want Ethan Carter released immediately, and I want federal agents present for that release. No more opportunities for accidents. Across town, Madeline found refuge at a fellow journalist's home. Her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. Evidence received, hold tight. I'll be Emily Hart, she whispered, finally understanding who had been helping them from inside the precinct. The night deepened, but Millbrook was far from sleeping. FBI teams established surveillance points around the precinct, monitoring all activities. Inside, Mercer's desperation grew with each passing hour. Sir, Daniel Pierce reported, we can't find Hart in the evidence room. Something's wrong. Files are missing, body cam footage. We deleted it's like copies were made. Mercer slammed his fist into the wall. Find her and get me everything on Carter's family, sister, mother, everyone they want to play hardball. Let's show them how that really works. But his threats were already echoing in secure FBI recordings. Adding to the mountain of evidence against him, Hart had thought of everything, placing hidden devices throughout the precinct before making her escape. In his cell, Derek dozed fitfully, his injuries making real sleep impossible. The precinct's night shift buzzed with unusual activity, officers rushing about, shredders running continuously, worried conversations in hushed tones. Around 3 a.m., Colonel West's car pulled into Millbrook. He sat in the FBI's mobile command center, reviewing the evidence with Agent Collins. These officers didn't just arrest the wrong man, West said, his voice tight with controlled anger. They attacked one of our most decorated veterans, then tried to destroy his life to cover their mistake. Agent Collins nodded grimly. We have enough for multiple veterans, then tried to destroy his life to cover their mistake. Agent Collins nodded grimly. We have enough for multiple federal indictments, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, conspiracy. Want this ended by morning, West ordered. No more chances for them to hurt anyone else. The FBI teams mobilized quietly, taking positions around the precinct. Mercer, paranoid now, posted officers at every entrance, but he failed to notice the federal agents already inside, disguised as maintenance workers and cleaning staff. Olivia Bennett arrived at the federal building, where Madeline waited with her gathered evidence. Together, they prepared for the morning's legal battle, knowing that everything had to be perfect. Your brothers made it through the worst, Olivia assured Madeline. Now we dismantle the entire corrupt system. Inside the precinct, Mercer paced his office like a caged animal. Dawn was approaching, and with it would come questions he couldn't answer, evidence he couldn't explain away. His phone rang, the mayor, demanding answers about the FBI presence in town. It's being handled, Mercer assured him, but his voice lacked conviction. Just a misunderstanding about a routine arrest. A routine arrest that brought the Pentagon down on us? The mayor shot back. Fix this, Mercer, or we'll all go down. But fixing it was no longer possible. Hart's evidence had exposed too much, reached too many hands. The precinct's walls were closing in, and Marshall felt it. In the holding cells, Derek noticed a change in the officers' behavior. The usual arrogance was gone, replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations. Even Daniel Pierce, usually Mercer's staunchest ally, looked shaken. A young officer Derek hadn't seen before approached his cell, pretending to do a routine check. As he passed, he whispered, "Hold on. Help's coming." Outside, the FBI teams received their final briefing. Agent Collins laid out the plan. Simultaneous entry through all access points, securing evidence before it could be destroyed, detaining key officers before they could flee. Colonel West insisted on being present for the operation. "Ethan, Carter served under my command. I'll be there when he walks out." The first hint of dawn touched the horizon as the federal teams took their final positions. In her secure location, Hart watched her phone light up with messages from Olivia Bennett. The warrants were signed. The operation approved. Mercer made one last desperate move, ordering his officers to transfer Ethan to another facility. Get him out the back door now. But as his men approached the holding cells, federal agents emerged from their covered positions. The game was over before Mercer even knew it had begun. Federal agents. The call rang through the precinct as FBI teams breached every entrance simultaneously. Mercer reached for his weapon, but froze as Agent Collins's voice cut through the chaos. "Captain Roy Mercer. Hands where we can see them." Mercer reached for his weapon, but froze as Agent Collins's voice cut through the chaos. "Captain Roy Mercer. Hands where we can see them. You're under federal arrest for civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." The precinct erupted into controlled chaos. Some officers surrendered immediately, while others had to be subdued. Daniel Pierce tried to run, but made it only 3 steps before being tackled by federal agents. Through it all, Ethan remained calm in his cell, his military training evident in his composed demeanor. When Colonel West appeared, flanked by FBI agents, their eyes met in silent understanding. "Staff Sergeant Carter," West said as agents unlocked the cell. "Sorry we're late." Ethan stood straight despite his injuries, offering a crisp salute. "Better late than never." "Sir," Mercer watched in impotent rage as his precinct was systematically dismantled. Each computer seized, each file boxed as evidence, each officer interviewed separately. His carefully constructed kingdom of corruption crumbled in less than an hour. Outside, the morning sun illuminated a changed Millbrook. News crews arrived to capture the federal raid, their cameras recording as corrupt officers were let out in handcuffs. Madeline Carter stood with Olivia Bennett, documenting everything for her follow-up story. Emily Hart emerged from hiding, escorted by federal agents as she prepared to testify. Her evidence would prove crucial in the coming trials. But for now, she watched with quiet satisfaction as justice finally arrived at the precinct. The last image captured by news cameras that morning was Ethan Carter walking out of the precinct, supported by Colonel West on one side and his sister Madeline on the other. Despite his injuries, he moved with dignity, his military bearing unbroken. Mercer, in handcuffs, caught a final glimpse of the man he'd tried to break. But Ethan didn't spare him a glance. His focus was ahead, on the rising sun and the justice it brought with it. The federal raid had left the Millbrook Police Department in chaos, but amid the upheaval, Captain Roy Mercer managed to slip away. While FBI agents cataloged evidence and interviewed officers, he retreated to a rarely used storage room in the precinct's basement, gathering the few men he knew would follow him to the end. "Carter has to disappear," Mercer whispered to officers Daniel Pierce and Samuel Knox, his most loyal followers. "Tonight, make it look like suicide." These hero types often can't handle the shame of being exposed as frauds. Daniel Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with the feds watching?" "The feds are busy with their evidence collection upstairs. By the time they find him, we'll be long gone." Mercer's eyes had a dangerous gleam. "I've got contacts down south, new identities ready, but first we finish this." In her temporary office at the federal building, Officer Emily Hart felt her phone vibrate. A text from an unknown number. "Watch the basement. Am planning something. Even now." Some officers were choosing sides, hedging their bets as the precinct crumbled. Hart immediately contacted Agent Collins. "Mercer's not in custody yet. He's planning something for tonight. We know Agent Collins. Mercer's not in custody yet. He's planning something for tonight. We know," Collins replied, her voice tight. "We've got eyes on him, but we need to catch him in the act. Your job is to keep Carter safe until we move." The holding cells had been cleared of other detainees, but Derek remained in custody while the FBI processed his release paperwork. His injuries from Mercer's interrogation had been photographed and documented each bruise and cut adding to the federal case. Through the cell bars, Derek watched the precinct's usual rhythm dissolve into barely controlled chaos. Officers hurried past, some looking shell-shocked, others angry. A few met his eyes with something like respect or fear. The power dynamics had shifted, and everyone knew it. "Your sister's article is everywhere," Olivia Bennett told him during Orpheer. The power dynamics had shifted, and everyone knew it. "Your sister's article is everywhere," Olivia Bennett told him during a brief visit. "The Pentagon's involved now. You just need to hold on a few more hours." Ethan nodded, but something in his special ops training was sending warning signals. Mercer was too quiet, too contained. A man like that wouldn't go down without trying to take everyone with him. As evening approached, Hart made her way to the holding area, pretending to process routine paperwork. She'd changed into civilian clothes, her badge and gun turned in during the investigation, but she carried herself like she belonged there. "Officer Hart," a voice called out. Daniel Pierce stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "This area is restricted now," Mercer's orders. "Just finishing transfer papers," Hart replied, noting how Daniel Pierce's hand rested near his weapon. "Won't be long." But as she turned to leave, Daniel Pierce grabbed her arm. "You've got a choice to make, Hart, right now. Are you with us or against us?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications. Then Hart saw something in Daniel Pierce's eyes, not threat but warning. He was giving her a chance to run. "I need some air," she said carefully. "I'll come back later." Daniel Pierce released her, and Hart walked away. Her steps measured until she was out of sight. Then she ran, pulling out her phone to send a warning. To Agent Collins. Night fell over Millbrook, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The FBI presence had thinned. Most agents focused on processing evidence at the federal building. In the holding area, Derek noticed the regular officers being replaced by Mercer's trusted few. "Shift change," Samuel Knox announced. But something in his tone made Derek's combat instincts flare. These men weren't here to guard him. They were here to end him. Mercer appeared shortly after midnight, carrying a bundle of cloth. "Sad story," he said, unfolding what Ethan now recognized as bed sheets. "Decorated veteran, falsely accused, takes his own life in custody, almost poetic." "You really think anyone will believe that?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the pain in his ribs. "They'll believe what we tell them to believe. They always have." Mercer turned to his men. "Watch the doors. This won't take long." But as Daniel Pierce and Samuel Knox moved to their positions, another figure appeared in the corridor. Officer Hart, still in civilian clothes, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. "Came to say goodbye, Hart," Mercer sneered. "Good. You can help with the paperwork. Lots of forms when a prisoner commits suicide." Hart moved closer, her movements casual but deliberate. "Actually, sir, I needed to return this." She reached into her pocket, and Mercer tensed, but she withdrew only a key card. For the evidence room, she let it fall, the clatter echoing in the quiet corridor. As Mercer's attention followed the card, Hart's other hand moved, sliding. A security badge through the cell bars behind her back. "Get rid of her," Mercer ordered Daniel Pierce, but Hart was already backing away. "Of course, sir. Just remember what you taught us. Always document everything." Her eyes met Ethan's briefly before she turned to leave. The message was clear. She'd given him a way out. Now he had to take it. Daniel Pierce followed Hart, while Mercer returned his attention to Ethan. Time to end this story. He nodded to Samuel Knox, who opened the cell door. Ethan had been waiting for this moment. Despite his injuries, despite the exhaustion, his body responded with trained precision. As Samuel Knox entered the cell, Ethan exploded into action. The first strike caught Samuel Knox in the throat, cutting off his cry for help. The second sent him crashing into Mercer, creating precious seconds of confusion. In that moment, Derek slipped. Past them, Hart's security badge clutched in his hand. "Stop him!" Mercer's roar echoed through the corridors. But Derek was already running. His special's roar echoed through the corridors, But Ethan was already running, his special ops training guiding him through the precinct's maze-like layout. Somewhere above, a door slammed. Footsteps thundered down stairwells as Mercer mobilized his remaining loyal officers. But Ethan had the advantage. He'd spent hours memorizing patrol patterns, shift changes, and security camera positions. The precinct's emergency lights cast everything in an eerie red glow. Ethan moved like a shadow, using every trick he'd learned in combat to stay ahead of his pursuers. His ribs screamed with each movement, but adrenaline kept him going. All exits are covered. Mercer's voice crackled over the radio Ethan had grabbed from Samuel Knox. He's trapped in here with us, but Ethan wasn't trying to escape, not yet. First, he needed evidence. Hard had given him more than just a way out of his cell. She'd given him access to the entire precinct. The security badge worked on a maintenance door, leading him to a service corridor. Here, in the building's guts, he could move more freely. Years of tactical operations had taught him how to turn an enemy's territory against them. Meanwhile, Hard had slipped away from Daniel Pierce, who'd deliberately taken his time in escorting her out. She now sat in an FBI surveillance van 2 blocks away, providing real-time intelligence about the precinct's layout. The maintenance tunnels connect to the old records room, she told Agent Collins. They'll expect him to go up trying to escape, but Carter's smarter than that. Collins nodded, mobilizing her teams. How long until Mercer realizes what's really happening? Not long, Hart replied. He's paranoid, but he's not stupid. Inside the precinct, Derek made his way to the records room. Decades of paperwork filled the shelves, but he wasn't interested in old files. His target was a ventilation shaft that led to Mercer's office. Above him, he could hear Mercer coordinating the search. Check every room, every closet. He's here somewhere. And when you find him, don't bother with arrests. Ethan moved silently through the ventilation system, years of special ops training, making his movements fluid despite his injuries. Through the grates, he could see officers searching below, their frustration growing with each empty room. Marshall's office was dark when Ethan finally reached it. Carefully, he removed the vent cover and dropped down. His ribs protested, but he pushed through the pain. The office would hold the evidence he needed. Mercer was too arrogant to believe anyone would dare enter his sanctuary. The desk drawers were locked, but Derek's military training hadn't just taught him how to fight. Within seconds, he had them open, revealing files that documented years of corruption. Names, dates, payoffs. Mercer had recorded everything. Sir, a voice called from the corridor. The office. Someone's inside. Ethan grabbed what he could, but he knew he was out of time. Footsteps approached rapidly, and he could hear Mercer's voice among them. The office door burst open just as Ethan pulled himself back into the ventilation shaft. Bullets pierced the metal around him as Mercer emptied his clip in rage. Find him, Mercer screamed. Tear this place apart. But Ethan was already moving, the stolen file secured against his chest. The ventilation system would take him to the east wing, where the building's oldest section stood. Hart had mentioned it during his custody, a part of the precinct that had been abandoned during renovations. Outside, FBI teams moved into position. Agent Collins's voice crackled over their secure channel. All units ready. Wait for my signal. Inside, Mercer's rage reached new heights as reports of Derek's elusiveness poured in. He's making us look like fools, he snarled at Daniel Pierce. This ends now. Burn it down if you have to, but find him. Daniel Pierce hesitated. Sir, with all the federal evidence stored here, I said burn it. Mercer's composure had cracked completely. Better it all burns than they get their hands on what's in those files. But Daniel Pierce was already backing away, seeing the madness in his superior's eyes. Like rats from a sinking ship, Mercer's remaining loyal officers began to distance themselves from him. Ethan moved through the old section of the precinct, where emergency lights flickered weakly. Water dripped from ancient pipes, and the air smelled of mold and decay. Here, the walls held decades of secrets, of corruption that had festered long before Mercer's time. He found what he was looking for in a forgotten locker room. A window, small but large enough to squeeze through. But as he worked to open it, a sound made him freeze. Quite a chase. Mercer's voice came from the darkness. But it's over now. Ethan turned slowly. Mercer stood in the doorway, gun aimed steadily. Behind him, Daniel Pierce lingered uncertainly. You know what happens. Next, Mercer continued. The violent fugitive shot while attempting escape. A tragic end to a sad story. Is that what you'll tell the FBI? Derek asked calmly. What about the evidence I just found in your office? Mercer's smile was cold. What evidence? Everything burns tonight. Clean slate. Sir, Daniel Pierce interrupted. FBI units are moving, and we need to. Shut up. Mercer snapped. One last loose end to tie up, then we're gone. But as he took aim at Ethan, Daniel Pierce made his choice. His tackle caught Mercer by surprise, sending the gun skittering across the floor. Run! Daniel Pierce yelled as he grappled with his former boss. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the files and squeezed through the window just as Mercer broke free, his roar of rage following Ethan into the night. Outside, FBI teams converged. On the precinct, Agent Collins's voice cut through the chaos. Move in. Now. Buttrick's escape had already sparked Mercer's final desperate act. As federal agents breached the building, smoke began pouring from multiple points. The fire spread quickly through the old structure, feeding on decades of paper records. He's burning everything, Hart realized in horror, destroying all the evidence. But she didn't know about the files Derek carried, or the recordings she'd already secured. Mercer's attempt to erase his crimes would only add arson to his growing list of charges. In the chaos of the FBI raid and the growing fire, Mercer made his break. He fought his way past federal agents, using his knowledge of the building to slip away into the night. But his F. Samuel Knoxam would be short-lived. Derek emerged from the shadows near the FBI command post, the stolen files clutched against his chest as medics rushed to treat his injuries. He handed the documents to Agent Collins. Everything's here. He said years of corruption, all documented in Mercer's own hand, the precinct burned behind them, decades of secrets turning to ash. But the truth had already escaped, carried out by a soldier who'd refused to break, protected by an officer who'd chosen right over loyalty, preserved by all those who dared to stand against corruption. Dawn approached as firefighters brought the blaze under control. Mercer was now a fugitive, but his power was broken. The files Derek had rescued would dismantle not just one corrupt sergeant, but an entire system that had protected him. In the growing light, Derek watched the precinct smolder. Hart stood nearby, finally able to breathe freely after months of living in fear. Daniel Pierce sat in an FBI vehicle already turning state's evidence. Ready to give your statement? Agent Collins asked, approaching with a medic. Derek nodded, but his eyes were on the horizon. The night's darkness was fading, and with it, the shadows that had hidden corruption for so long. A new day was coming to Millbrook, bought with blood and courage, sealed with truth that not even fire could erase. Dawn broke over Millbrook as a line of black FBI vehicles rolled silently through the streets. In the lead car, Agent Vanessa Collins reviewed the final operation plans, while Colonel West listened intently from the back seat. The burning precinct had been contained, but Mercer remained at large, and evidence suggested he still had supporters inside the department. All teams in position. Collins's radio crackled. Standing by for your order. Inside what remained of the precinct, chaos reigned. The fire had destroyed parts of the building, but the main structure still stood, filled with nervous officers who knew their world was about to change forever. Some frantically shredded documents, while others made hurried phone calls, trying to secure deals before the federal hammer fell. Ethan Carter sat in the FBI's mobile command center, his injuries finally treated properly. Through the bank of monitors, he watched the operation unfold. His military training helped him spot details others might miss. Officers positioning themselves strategically, hidden weapons being moved, encrypted communications being passed. They're preparing for resistance, he told Agent Collins, pointing to movement on the screen. See how they're clustering near the armory. That's not standard procedure, Collins nodded grimly. Mercer's loyalists won't go down without a fight. She keyed her radio. All units be advised possible armed resistance near the armory. Proceed with extreme caution. Officer Emily Hart, now working directly with the FBI, highlighted areas on the precinct's blueprint. These officers here are most likely to resist, she explained, marking positions. They were part of Mercer's inner circle, benefited most from his corruption. The first FBI teams moved in precisely at 6 a.m., their entry coordinated with military precision. Federal agents. The call echoed through the building as doors burst open simultaneously. Some officers immediately surrendered, hands raised, already preparing to turn evidence against their colleagues. Others reached for weapons, but froze when they saw the overwhelming federal presence. A few tried to run, only to find every exit covered. On your knees. Hands where we can see them. Federal agents swarmed through the precinct, securing weapons and gathering evidence. The scale of the operation was unprecedented in Millbrook's history. Officer Daniel Pierce, still in custody after helping Ethan escape, watched from an FBI vehicle as his former colleagues were let out in handcuffs. His face showed a mix of relief and regret as he continued providing information about Mercer's operation. The evidence isn't just in the files, he explained to Agent Collins. It's in offshore accounts, property deeds, shell companies. Mercer built an empire on corruption, and half the department helped him do it. Inside the precinct, federal agents discovered the true extent of the corruption. Hidden rooms revealed stockpiles of confiscated drugs and weapons that had never been logged into evidence. Computer files showed years of falsified reports, tampered evidence, and forced confessions. Sir, an agent called out, waving Colonel West over to a locked cabinet they'd just opened. You need to see this. Inside were hundreds of military IDs, driver's licenses, and other documents confiscated from veterans and minorities who'd been falsely arrested. Each represented a life disrupted, a person victimized by Mercer's corrupt system. West's jaw tightened as he examined the collection. Get these back to their owners, he ordered. And I want every case involving these IDs reopened. In another part of the building, Hart led agents to a hidden safe in Mercer's office. He kept his most sensitive files here, she explained. Records of payoffs, blackmail material, evidence of other departments he was working with. The safe, damaged but intact after the fire, contained exactly what she described. Page after page documented Mercer's widespread corruption network, reaching far beyond Millbrook's borders. This isn't just one corrupt precinct, Collins realized, scanning the documents. It's an entire network of dirty cops, judges, and politicians. Outside, news crews gathered as word of the raid spread. Madeline Carter, now working with multiple national outlets, coordinated coverage that would expose the full scope of the corruption to the world. Sources inside the FBI confirmed that dozens of officers have been arrested, she reported, standing in front of the precinct. The investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and organized criminal activity within the department. The morning wore on as more revelations emerged. Officers who had maintained their innocence were confronted with irrefutable evidence of their crimes. Those who had participated in Mercer's scheme began turning on each other, hoping to secure better deals for themselves. In the command center, Derek reviewed footage from his arrest with federal investigators, identifying officers who had participated in his abuse. Each name he provided was a different name. The name of the person who had participated in the murder was not known. Federal investigators, identifying officers who had participated in his abuse. Each name he provided led to another thread of corruption, another chain of evidence linking back to Mercer. These officers here, he pointed to the screen, they knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just following orders. They were active participants in the corruption. Hart, watching, beside him, nodded in agreement. They were Marshall's ICE most trusted team used for special assignments, falsifying evidence, intimidating witnesses, whatever needed to be done. The FBI's forensic teams worked methodically through the precinct, recovering data from burned computers and piecing together shredded documents. Every piece of evidence confirmed what Hart and Daniel Pierce had revealed. Years of systematic corruption, hundreds of false arrests, millions in stolen money and assets. "Look at this," an analyst called out, pointing to his screen. They were running their own drug operation, confiscating from legitimate busts and then reselling through a network of dealers. Mercer was taking a cut of everything. The evidence painted a picture of corruption so deep and widespread that it seemed impossible it had remained hidden for so long. But as more officers began cooperating with investigators, the reason became clear. Mercer had built his power on a foundation of fear and mutual complicity. Nobody could speak up without implicating themselves, Daniel Pierce explained, and those who tried, well, accidents happened. Around noon, a breakthrough came in the search for Mercer. A traffic camera caught him entering a private airfield. On the outskirts of town, the FBI's tactical team mobilized immediately. "He's running," Collins announced, gathering her team. "We have 20 minutes before his plane is scheduled to take off." Derek insisted on joining the operation despite his injuries. "I know how he thinks," he argued, "and he'll be expecting federal agents, not someone he thinks is still in custody." Collins hesitated, but A.G. Samuel Knox. Derek's special ops experience could prove valuable, and this was personal for him in a way that went beyond normal law enforcement. The airfield was quiet when they arrived, but Derek spotted signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks, a fuel truck pulling away, lights on in the small terminal building. There, he pointed to a sleek private jet being prepared for takeoff. Registration number matches one of the shell companies from Mercer's files. FBI teams moved into position, surrounding the airfield with practiced efficiency. Through binoculars, Derek watched Mercer emerge from the terminal, surrounded by what appeared to be private security. "He's armed," Derek warned, noting the bulge of a shoulder holster under Mercer's jacket. "And his guards are ex-military contractors." This could get messy, but Mercer had run out of options and allies. As he approached the plane, FBI vehicles roared onto the tarmac from all directions. Helicopter rotors thundered overhead as federal tactical teams rappelled down, cutting off every escape route. "Sergeant Roy Mercer," Collins's voice boomed through a megaphone. "You're surrounded by federal agents. Surrender immediately." For a moment, Mercer's hand moved toward his weapon. His security team tensed, reading for a fight. But as more agents emerged, weapons trained, even Mercer realized it was over. "On your knees." The order came as federal agents closed in, hands behind your head. The man who had terrorized Millbrook for years finally knelt on the tarmac, his empire of corruption crumbling around him. As agents cuffed him, Ethan stepped into view, wanting Mercer to see him standing free. Their eyes met briefly. Mercer's face contorted with rage, but beneath the anger was something else. Fear. He had finally met an opponent he couldn't intimidate, couldn't corrupt, couldn't break. Captain Roy Mercer. Collins read the charges as agents led him. To a waiting vehicle. "You are under arrest for civil rights violations, conspiracy, evidence tampering, attempted murder." The list went on, each charge representing another piece of the corrupt system Mercer had built. His arrest was broadcast live across national news networks, Madeline's cameras capturing the moment justice finally caught up with him. Back at the precinct, the FBI's operation continued. Every officer was interviewed, every piece of evidence cataloged, every case potentially tainted by corruption flagged for review. The scope of the investigation grew with each new revelation. "We're looking at years of cases that need to be reopened, and FBI analysts reported hundreds of false arrests, wrongful convictions, civil rights violations. This will take months, maybe years to untangle, but the impact was already being felt as news of Mercer's arrest spread. People began coming forward with their own stories of abuse and corruption. Each account added to the growing picture of how deeply the corruption had penetrated Millbrook's justice system. Officer Hart provided crucial testimony, her detailed records and recordings forming the backbone of the federal case. Her courage in standing up to the corruption inspired other officers to come forward, creating a cascade of cooperation that helped investigators uncover even more crimes. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, she explained to federal investigators. It was about power and control. Mercer made sure everyone was complicit, Everyone had something to lose if the truth came out. Daniel Pierce's cooperation proved equally valuable. His years as Mercer's trusted lieutenant gave him insight into the corruption's inner workings. His testimony would help prosecutors understand how the corrupt system had operated and evolved. As evening approached, the FBI's initial raid had evolved into a full-scale federal operation. Additional teams arrived from neighboring offices, bringing specialized investigators and forensic experts. The investigation had grown beyond just one corrupt precinct. It now encompassed an entire network of criminal activity operating under the cover of law enforcement. Colonel West coordinated with veterans organizations to help identify and support service members who had been victimized by Mercer's department. Each case represented not just a crime, but a betrayal of those who had served their country. This isn't just about punishing corruption, West told reporters. It's about restoring faith in the system these veterans fought to protect. In the command center, Derek reviewed evidence with federal investigators, his military training, helping identify patterns and connections others might miss. Each document, each testimony, each piece of evidence helped complete the puzzle of Mercer's corrupt empire. He didn't just break the law, Ethan explained, pointing to a complex web of connections they'd mapped out. He rewrote it to serve his own purposes. Everything, arrests, evidence, testimonies, it was all manipulated to maintain his power. As night fell over Millbrook, the full impact of the day's events began to sink in. The corrupt system that had seemed invincible just days ago had been exposed and dismantled. Mercer's arrest marked not just the end of his reign, but the beginning of a long process of healing and reform. "This is just the beginning," Agent Collins told her team as they prepared to secure the evidence for transport. "We've exposed the corruption, but rebuilding trust in law enforcement will take time." Outside the precinct, citizens gathered in an impromptu vigil, holding candles and sharing stories of their experiences with Mercer's corrupt department. Among them were veterans who had been targeted, families who had been terrorized, and community leaders who had tried to fight the corruption. Ethan watched from the command center, his injuries aching but his spirit unbroken. The system that had tried to destroy him had instead been destroyed, brought down by the very values he had fought to defend: truth, justice, and the courage to stand against corruption. The night was still young, and much work remained. But as the FBI continued its methodical dismantling of Mercer's corrupt empire, one truth became clear. The reign of terror in Millbrook was over, and a new chapter of justice was about to begin. The federal courthouse in downtown Millbrook buzzed with anticipation as Ethan Carter walked through its marble halls. 2 weeks had passed since Mercer's arrest, and today marked the beginning of what prosecutors call the most significant police corruption trial in state history. Ethan's physical injuries had begun to heal, though he still moved carefully to protect his bruised ribs. He'd traded his prison jumpsuit for a crisp military dress uniform, his restored dog tags hanging proudly around his neck. The Pentagon had arranged for their repair, seeing them as a symbol of both the injustice he'd faced and the dignity he'd maintained. "Ready for this?" Madeline asked, walking beside him. Her article exposing the precinct's corruption had earned national attention, leading to a position with a major news network. But today she was here solely as a sister. Inside the courtroom, the scale of the federal case became clear. 3 prosecution teams sat at their tables surrounded by boxes of evidence. The defense section was equally crowded, filled with lawyers representing various officers and officials implicated in the corruption. Captain Roy Mercer sat with his attorneys, his police uniform replaced by an ill-fitting suit that seemed to emphasize how far he'd fallen. He didn't look at Ethan, but his jaw tightened visibly when the former soldier entered. U.S. Attorney Rebecca Lawrence rose to deliver the opening statement. What you will hear over the coming weeks is not just the story of one corrupt officer or even one corrupt precinct. She began, "This is the story of a criminal enterprise operating under the color of law, systematically violating the rights of citizens they swore to protect." The evidence was overwhelming. Officer Emily Hart took the stand first, her testimony painting a detailed picture of years of corruption. She walked the jury through recordings, documents, and photographs, her voice steady as she exposed the precinct's darkest secrets. It wasn't just about power, Hart explained. It was about creating a system where corruption was the norm, where speaking out meant risking everything. Officer Daniel Pierce and I weren't the only ones who saw what was happening, but we were among the few who finally found the courage to act. Mercer's attorney tried to discredit her during cross-examination, suggesting she was seeking revenge for being passed over for promotion. But Hart remained unshaken, her evidence too solid to dismiss. "I'm not here for revenge," she stated firmly. "I'm here because I took an oath to dismiss." "I'm not here for revenge," she stated firmly. "I'm here because I took an oath to protect and serve, and staying silent about corruption violates that oath." Daniel Pierce testified next. His former loyalty to Mercer transformed into a determination to expose everything. He detailed how the corrupt system had operated, from falsified reports to planted evidence to coordinated perjury. Mercer called it maintaining order, Daniel Pierce revealed. But it was about control and profit. We targeted specific communities, specific individuals. Veterans like Mr. Carter were especially vulnerable because Mercer knew how to manipulate their service records against them. The prosecution methodically built their case. Forensic accountants traced millions in stolen assets and bribes. Computer experts recovered deleted files, showing systematic evidence tampering. Former defendants testified about forced confessions and planted evidence. Olivia Bennett, now leading a team of civil rights attorneys, presented evidence of hundreds of false arrests and civil rights violations. Each case added another charge to the growing list against Mercer and his conspirators. "The pattern is clear," Bennett argued. "This wasn't random corruption or a few bad officers. This was an organized criminal operation wearing police badges." On the third day, Derek took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he described his arrest, the beatings, and the attempt on his life. His military bearing and clear testimony stood in stark contrast to the corruption he exposed. "I've served in war zones," Derek stated, looking directly at the jury. "I faced enemy combatants, but I never expected to face this kind of systematic abuse on American soil from those sworn to uphold the law." Mercer's attorney tried to paint Derek as anti-police, suggesting his military service had left him unable to respect civilian authority. The strategy backfired as Derek calmly referenced his work, helping other veterans navigate civilian life. "I respect legitimate authority," Derek responded. "What I experienced wasn't authority. It was abuse of power. There's a difference." Colonel West testified about Ethan's service record and the Pentagon's broader concerns about veterans being targeted by corrupt police departments. His testimony helped establish the national implications of the case. "When we send soldiers to defend democracy abroad, we don't expect them to face persecution from corrupt officials at home." West declared, "This case represents a betrayal of everything our service members fight to protect." As the trial progressed, more officers began accepting plea deals, turning against their former colleagues in exchange for leniency. Each new testimony revealed additional layers of corruption implicating judges, prosecutors, and city officials who had enabled or profited from Mercer's system. The mayor resigned in disgrace after evidence emerged of his role in covering up police misconduct. 2 judges were suspended pending federal investigation. The corruption had spread like a cancer through Millbrook's justice system, and removing IT required radical surgery. Outside the courthouse, the community began its own healing process. Veterans groups organized support services for those who had been victimized. Civil rights organizations helped people file claims for false arrests and wrongful convictions. The precinct's brutal history was being exposed and addressed, one case at a time. Derek became a symbol of resilience and justice, but he refused to let his story overshadow the broader issues. He worked with Colonel West to establish new protocols for protecting veterans' rights during police encounters, turning his experience into positive change. "This isn't just about one department or one city," Derek explained to reporters. "This is about ensuring that law enforcement serves all communities equally, that wearing a uniform, whether military or police, means upholding the highest standards of integrity." In the trial's second week, the prosecution revealed their strongest evidence, Mercer's own records. The detailed documentation of his corruption proved to be his undoing, showing how he had built and maintained his criminal empire. The defendant's own words and records proved the scope of his crimes. Prosecutor Lawrence argued he didn't just break the law. He created an alternate system of justice where he was judge, jury, and executioner. Mercer finally broke his silence, taking the stand in his own defense. His testimony was a study in arrogance and self-justification, claiming he had only done what was necessary to maintain order. Sometimes maintaining law and order requires strong measures, he insisted. Everything I did was for the good of the city. But under cross-examination, his facade cracked. Confronted with evidence of his crimes, his explanations became increasingly desperate. When Prosecutor Lawrence presented proof of his attempt to have Derek killed, Mercer's composed demeanor finally shattered. He was threatening everything. "We'd built," Mercer shouted, his careful script forgotten. "These people come here demanding rights, demanding respect, but they don't understand how things work." The outburst sealed his fate. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict, guilty on all counts. Mercer faced life in prison, his empire of corruption finally and completely destroyed. As the verdict was read, Ethan Rick sat with his sister and Colonel West watching justice being served. The moment represented more than personal vindication. It was a victory for everyone who had suffered under Mercer's corrupt regime. The aftermath brought sweeping changes to Millbrook's law enforcement. The Department of Justice appointed a federal overseer to rebuild the police department from the ground up. New policies were implemented, focusing on community policing and accountability. Hart, her whistleblower status now a badge of honor, helped develop new training programs, emphasizing ethical policing and civil rights. Her experience became a case study in police academies across the country, teaching future officers about the importance of standing up to corruption. Daniel Pierce received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but more importantly, his testimony helped investigators identify and prosecute corrupt officers in other departments. The case sparked investigations in multiple jurisdictions, exposing similar patterns of corruption. The Pentagon established a new office specifically focused on protecting veterans' civil rights, with Derek serving as a special advisor. His experience helped shape new policies for handling encounters between law enforcement and service members. What happened in Millbrook can happen anywhere corruption is allowed to flourish, Derek testified before a congressional committee. The solution isn't just prosecuting bad officers. It's creating systems that prevent corruption from taking root in the first place. Olivia Bennett and her legal team continued their work, reviewing hundreds of cases tainted by Mercer's corruption. Each overturned conviction, each restored right, represented another step toward healing the community's wounds. Madeline's reporting expanded beyond Millbrook, exposing similar patterns of corruption in other departments. Her work earned multiple journalism awards and, more importantly, helped other communities identify and address police misconduct. The Ive Federal Courthouse became a symbol of transformation, hosting weekly meetings where community members could meet with Justice Department officials to discuss reforms. The same halls where Mercer had been convicted now echoed with conversations about rebuilding trust between police and citizens. 1 month after the verdict, Derek stood before a crowd at Veterans Memorial Park, where his ordeal had begun. The restored dog tags around his neck caught the sunlight as he addressed the gathered veterans, activists, and community members. What happened in this city wasn't just about corrupt police or violated rights, he declared. It was about the choice we all face when confronted with injustice. Do we stay silent or do we stand up? Do we accept corruption as inevitable or do we fight for the principles we believe in? The crowd included Hart Daniel Pierce, under federal custody, Colonel West, and countless others who had played roles in exposing and ending Mercer's corruption. Each represented a different aspect of the struggle for justice. The whistleblower, the reformed insider, the military leader, the community activist. The hardest battle I ever fought wasn't overseas, Ethan continued. It was right here against people who had sworn to protect and serve. But that battle showed me something important. Corruption only flourishes when good people stay silent. Change happens when we find the courage to speak truth to power. As he finished speaking, a young black veteran approached, offering a crisp salute. "Your stand changed things, sir," the young man said. The new department actually treats us with respect now. They remember what happened to you, and they know we're watching. The moment captured the true impact of the case. Not just justice served, but systems changed, communities empowered, and a new generation inspired to stand against corruption. The sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the park, where Ethan had once run with Shadow, unaware of the storm about to break over his life. But unlike that evening, these shadows no longer concealed corruption and abuse. The light of justice had exposed the darkness, and Millbrook was finally on the path to becoming what every American city should be, a place where the law truly served all its citizens equally. 6 months after Mercer's conviction, Derek, Carter walked the streets of his old neighborhood, Shadow padding faithfully beside him. The morning air carried the crispness of early autumn, and American flags fluttered from front porches, a sight that meant something different to Ethan. Now something more personal. The neighborhood had changed since his arrest. Where police cruisers once prowled menacingly, community patrol officers now walked their beats, stopping to chat with residents. Many wore body cameras prominently displayed, not just as policy, but as a proud symbol of transparency. The reforms that had grown from Mercer's downfall had transformed more than just apartment procedures. They had changed the entire relationship between police and community. Mr. Carter, a young boy, called out, running from his front yard. "Mom, look, it." Mr. Carter, a young boy, called out, running from his front yard. "Mom, look, it's Mr. Carter." The child's mother smiled and waved from her porch. Before his ordeal, Ethan had been just another face in the neighborhood. Now his story had become part of the community's shared history, a testament to resilience and the power of standing up to injustice. The new officers actually listened, the boy's mother said, pride evident in her voice. "My son wants to join the force when he grows up. Before everything that happened with you, I would have been terrified of that idea. Now I'm actually proud of his choice." As they continued their walk, Ethan and Shadow passed the site of his arrest. The spot where his dog tags had broken now bore a small memorial plaque installed by local veterans groups. Justice begins with one voice standing against wrong. It read. The simple message had become a rallying cry for police reform movements across the country. The gas station where everything had started looked different now. The young teen he'd seen being harassed that night, Jason Miller, now worked there after school. The new owners had instituted a community outreach program, offering job opportunities to local youth. Got accepted to State University, Jason called out proudly, "Your sister's scholarship program helped make it happen." Madeline's work had expanded far beyond her initial expose. Her investigation into Mercer's corruption had launched her national career, but she'd used that platform to create real change. The scholarship foundation she'd established helped children of wrongfully arrested parents pursue higher education. The old precinct building had been transformed into a community center. Through the large windows, Ethan could see Officer Hart leading a youth program session. She'd retired from active duty, but had found a new calling teaching young people about civic engagement and responsible law enforcement. Inside, the walls that had once held evidence of corruption now displayed artwork created by local children, their visions of community and justice rendered in bright colors and hopeful images. The holding cells had been converted into classroom spaces where retired judges taught citizens about their rights and community advocates helped people navigate the legal system. Just finished another session, Hart said, joining him outside. "You should hear these kids, Ethan. They understand things about justice and accountability that took me years to learn. Your story really opened their eyes. Open all our eyes." They discussed Daniel Pierce's upcoming release from minimum security prison, where he'd served his reduced sentence for cooperating with prosecutors. He'd already signed up to speak at police academies, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about corruption and redemption. A news van arrived and Madeline emerged with her camera crew. The 1-year mark since Mercer's conviction had sparked renewed national interest in Millbrook's transformation. As they set up in Veterans Memorial Park, Ethan reflected on how this place, where his evening runs had once made him a target, had become a symbol of community revival. The hardest part wasn't the arrest or even the abuse. He explained during the interview, Shadow's head resting on his knee. It was seeing how deep the corruption ran, how it had poisoned relationships between people who should have been protecting and serving each other. But that also showed us where to start healing, with truth, with accountability, and with a commitment to real change. At the federal building, Olivia Bennett maintained her office, her legal team still working through cases tainted by Mercer's corruption. Each overturned conviction, each restored right, added another piece to the community's recovery. We've cleared nearly 300 cases so far, she reported. Each one represents a life impacted, a family affected. But you know what's most powerful? When these people get their records cleared, they're not just angry about the past. They're invested in making sure it never happens again. The afternoon found Derek at the new police academy, where Colonel West was implementing revolutionary changes in training procedures. The Pentagon's involvement hadn't ended with Mercer's conviction. They had committed to creating new protocols for police interactions with veterans, using Millbrook as a pilot program. Your experience changed everything, one cadet told him after the session. We learn about corruption through your story, but we also learn about integrity, about the courage to stand up for what's right. It makes the badge mean something different, something better. Evening brought a ceremony at the community center where Heart Youth Program was graduating its first class of peer mediators. Among them was Jason Miller's younger sister, Teresa, now planning to study criminal justice and become part of the continuing changes in law enforcement. Thank you for showing us we can fight back, she told Derek during the reception, not with violence or hatred, but with truth and determination. At the veterans shelter, where he now served as a board member, Derek met with Robert Hayes, the homeless veteran who had recognized him in the holding cell during his arrest. Now a peer counselor, Robert helped other veterans navigate civilian life. Remember what I told you in that cell? Robert asked, that taking you down would bring heat? Never imagined it would bring this kind of change, though. You didn't just expose corruption. You showed us all how to stand up for something better. As night fell over Millbrook, Ethan and Shadow made their way home through streets that felt both familiar and transformed. His phone buzzed with messages. Another department requesting their joint presentation on reform, an invitation to speak at the Pentagon's new Civil Rights Division, a letter from a young veteran who had successfully challenged police misconduct, using protocols developed from Millbrook's experience. The restored dog tags hung nearby as Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing materials for tomorrow's Community Oversight Committee meeting. Their meaning had deepened beyond just representing his military service. They now symbolized a different kind of battle, one fought not on foreign soil, but in the hearts of his own community. Through his window, he could see lights on in neighboring houses, people moving about their evening routines with a confidence that had been missing during Mercer's reign. Children played in yards after dark, elderly residents sat on porches. Teenage couples walked hand in hand. Simple activities that had once carried risk now reclaimed as normal parts of community life. A police cruiser passed slowly, its community patrol officer waving to residents. The simple gesture, once unthinkable, represented everything that had changed. The badge was no longer a symbol of oppression, but had been restored to its true meaning: protection, service, and justice for. No longer a symbol of oppression, but had been restored to its true meaning: protection, service, and justice for. All Mercer sat in his maximum security cell, his empire of corruption dismantled, his power reduced to memories and cautionary tales. But here in Millbrook, people were building something far more powerful than corruption. They were building a community based powerful than corruption. They were building a community based on trust, accountability, and the courage to stand up for what was right. The physical scars from Ethan's ordeal had faded, but the experience had left deeper marks. Not wounds, but wisdom. He had gone from soldier to victim to symbol of justice, but his most important role lay ahead, helping others continue the work of reform and renewal. Shadow patted over, resting his head on Ethan's knee as they looked out at the city they had helped transform. The night settled over Millbrook, peaceful and full of promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to strengthen the changes they'd fought so hard to achieve. But for now, Ethan was content knowing that his stand against injustice had helped create something lasting and meaningful, a legacy of hope that would continue long after his own story faded into history. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives that challenge us to look deeper into the shadows of our society and find the courage to light them up.